Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing a San Jose Sharks trade deadline recap. It was a big day for San Jose, but it didn't start out looking like it was going to be all that crowded for San Jose. Through the first few hours of the day, they made a single move, which was pretty minor, and as we got to the last hour, the last half hour before that deadline time was reached, it felt as though maybe the Sharks would have failed to move on from some of their unrestricted free agents by the end of the season. But, of course, a huge splash was made by the San Jose Sharks, perhaps the biggest trade of the day, though we'll get to talking about that a bit later on. We'll start off with the smaller moves that San Jose made, the first of which was the first move that they made on the day, which was acquiring Kahkonen from the Detroit Red Wings in exchange for Radim Simek, as well as a 7th round pick in 2024. This was clearly a kind of reclamation project type of swap between these two teams. As we all know from being San Jose Sharks fans, Radim Simek was at one point a very good defenseman for San Jose, came up, played on that top pairing with Brent Burns, and was essentially the Wookiee whisperer, so to speak, as he was doing so well in that particular role. But unfortunately, a big injury ended up derailing not only that particular season, but pretty much the entirety of his career thus far, as he never actually found his footing back with the San Jose Sharks. He would still play a few games here or there, but in those games, he was clearly nowhere near that top pairing defenseman level that he had been when he had originally made his debut for San Jose. And this year, he spent the majority of the season with the San Jose Barracuda. So this is an opportunity to get a change of scenery for him and see if he can maybe get back to that level on a new team with the Detroit Red Wings. Coming back the other way is Kahkonen, who's hoping for the same type of turnaround. It was just last year where Kahkonen actually had some decent success with the Edmonton Oilers, over 20 points and 11 goal scorers. Certainly not terrible stats in the NHL for a player of his caliber, a former first-round pick. But this year with the Detroit Red Wings, he has struggled immensely and has just not been a good player, and as such has not been playing all that consistent amount of times in the NHL. And so this is going to be the opportunity for him to also turn things around, coming to a complete change of scenery in San Jose. The reasoning, I would imagine, for why the Sharks had to give up that extra 7th round pick, which is realistically not all that valuable of an asset, is because Simek hasn't been good for a few years, while Kahkonen has really only had this one down year in his since his good year last year with the Edmonton Oilers. So it's technically more likely that Kahkonen would bounce back and rebound from that and actually become a decent NHL player. So it's likely that the Sharks had to add a bit of a sweetener to the deal, but not a terrible trade for San Jose, I would say. The next move is an interesting one, I guess. Very, very small potatoes here. A 7th round pick traded by the San Jose Sharks in exchange for Devin Cooley from the Buffalo Sabres, a goaltender. Now, this isn't some goaltending prospect diamond in the rough. He is 26 years old, not super old, but not exactly the type of goaltender that you're hoping will become the starter for the San Jose Sharks within the next few years, but is perhaps filling a gap that is left by a further trade down the line that I'll get to a bit later, so nothing super exciting here to really talk about. Then we get to the next trade on the day. That is Nikita Okhotiuk being traded to the Calgary Flames in exchange for a 5th round pick. Interesting, because it wasn't expected that Okhotiuk would be on the trading block, but I guess it shouldn't really come as that much of a surprise. The Sharks are a very clearly rebuilding team, and so outside of a very few untouchable players like William Eklund or Henry Thrun, pretty much anybody could be sold for the right price. And so if Calgary Flame came calling and said, hey, we'll give you a draft pick for Nikita Okhotiuk, it certainly makes sense for why Mike Grier would accept that. Okhotiuk was doing some okay things for San Jose, but it didn't look like he would really amount to much more than like a fringe 7th defenseman at the NHL. Still relatively young, but not so young where you're thinking that there's infinite potential there or anything like that. So the fact that they managed to get a draft pick out of Okhotiuk is honestly a decent bit of tidy work there from Mike Grier. So this is a trade that I am satisfied with, but of course it doesn't really blow me away. The next deal is that we're getting the increasing intensity and actual mattering of these trades is a bit of a weird one. Definitely a head scratcher here, as the Sharks trade Kahkonen to the New Jersey Devils, which is not a surprise to see him move, but the return that they get back is a 7th round pick as well as goaltender Vitek Vanacek from the Devils. I thought that if Kahkonen was going to get moved, it would be relatively similar to the trade that we saw earlier today, let's say the Montreal Canadiens made with Jake Allen, where I believe they got a conditional third-round pick in return for his services. I thought Kahkonen would get something like that, but the fact that they go pretty much straight for a one-for-one goaltending swap with just the small sweetener 7th-round pick is definitely somewhat odd. And Kahkonen and Vanecek have been essentially polar opposites over these last couple of years. Last season, Kahkonen was terrible, one of the worst goaltenders in the NHL, and this season, outside of the last couple of weeks where he has really struggled and have completely tanked his stats completely, he has looked quite good on a really bad San Jose Sharks team. Vanecek, very much the opposite. Last season, he was really good for the New Jersey Devils and helped lead them strongly into the playoffs, but then in the postseason of that year, he kind of fell off a cliff and was a big reason for why the Devils couldn't actually get past the second round in what was really looking like a strong season for New Jersey. And then when it comes to this season, Vanecek has struggled to keep the reins as the starting goaltender for the Devils, and he has been one of the worst goaltenders in the entire league. And so kind of like with the first trade that the Sharks made for when it came to Simek and Kostin, this is perhaps like a change of scenery a bit, at least for Vanecek. But when it comes to Kaapo Kahkonen, it feels as though this is the type of move that is made because Mike Grier and the Sharks coaching staff just don't really have a lot of faith in Kahkonen and feel as though his strong start to this season was maybe a bit more of a flash in the pan compared to a new consistent level that Kahkonen will actually be able to reach. And so they have more hope in Vanecek, who looked really good last season for New Jersey, to be a guy that the Sharks can rely on over these next couple of years, or maybe a guy who can retain a decent bit more value for the San Jose Sharks if they perhaps look to trade him a couple of years down the line. And the thing that I mentioned earlier on when it came to Devin Cooley is that one interesting thing to note here about Vanecek is that it is said that he might actually not play another game this season, that he is injured perhaps for the rest of the year, so we don't actually know if Vanecek will even suit up for the San Jose Sharks in these last 20 games of the season, which is perhaps another reason for why the Sharks did go out and pick up Devin Cooley, especially when you consider the fact that Mackenzie Blackwood is also still on IR, though that's not viewed to be particularly serious. The Sharks will need at least a goaltender to play, and while they may not want Magnus Krona to do that, especially after his performance last night, Devin Cooley could end up getting a couple of games, who knows. But now let's move on to the real trade of the day, the big one that blew everybody away, completely surprising, out of left field, just out of nowhere here deal, as the Sharks trade Tomas Hertl to the Vegas Golden Knights, along with a third-round pick in 2025 and a third-round pick in 2027 for the Vegas Golden Knights' first-round pick in 2025, as well as David Edstrom, who, it should be noted, was the Golden Knights' first-round pick last year in 2023, since the Golden Knights did win the Stanley Cup. That means that is the 32nd overall pick. Now, you look at this trade and immediately you might be somewhat underwhelmed, especially when you consider the fact that both of these third-round picks are from the San Jose Sharks, who are not expected to be a very good team even as far as 2027, which means these are going to be early third-round picks compared to the Vegas Golden Knights, where Edstrom was a very late, the latest possible first-round pick, and in 2025 it's expected the Golden Knights should still be pretty good, and so that will likely also end up being a late first-round pick, which means instead of moving up like 2 full rounds in the draft, you're likely moving up closer to like 30 to 35 overall choices. Still pretty good and still a very notable upgrade, but not as fantastic as it may seem. But the fact remains is that Tomas Hertl has a massive contract. He's over the age of 30. He hasn't been doing particularly well this season, so it was a pretty difficult move, and it's why this trade is so surprising, because it didn't feel as though the Sharks would ever actually be able to trade Tomas Hertl. The perfect opportunity to move on from Hertl was a couple of years ago. This was before Mike Grier's time, and so there's no blame to dish out towards him. But this was at the time where Doug Wilson had stepped away from the teams for medical reason, and so Joe Will was filling in as interim general manager, and he was forced with a tough decision of whether or not to keep Hertl on the team by re-signing him or to trade him either prior to that year or at the deadline of that season. And for whatever reason, even though I had personally believed that trading Hertl would have been a very good choice and they likely would have gotten more value than they did from this trade, for whatever reason the Sharks decided to sign and keep Tomas Hertl for the next 8 years. And now 2 years down the line, Greer has to take less value in exchange for Hertl, most likely, to get out from under that contract. But another thing that is incredibly important to mention here when it comes to this Hertl deal, because you might be thinking, well, they got rid of the contract anyway, so it's really not all that bad, and they got a first-round pick, a former first-round pick. It's a pretty decent trade, is that the Sharks did have to retain money on this contract. Now, it's only $1.25 million of the $8 million, and considering the Sharks have so much cap space, even over the next 6 years, this is unlikely to ever play that significant of a role and in stopping the San Jose Sharks from doing anything that they actually want to do. But what's more important about it, something that I talked about in my yesterday's video for the Anthony Duclair trade, is that this now takes up a salary retention slot for the San Jose Sharks, and because this contract has 6 more years after this season, that means it's going to be long-term on the San Jose Sharks books there. That will go with the Erik Karlsson trade, which will be on the Sharks books for a few more years after this one as well as the Brent Burns deal, which does not expire at the end of this season, but instead at the end of next season. So this was a big reason for why the Sharks couldn't trade also players like Hoffman or Labanc or Barabanov at this deal, because they couldn't at this trade deadline, because they couldn't retain any money on that contract. But next year, it's going to be much of the same thing. So for instance, if next year the Sharks would look to trade Jan Ruda in the final year of his contract or Mikael Granlund in the final year of his contract, they won't be able to retain any money on either of those deals. And especially for a player like Granlund, who's making $5 million, not being able to retain 50% of that is going to make it insanely difficult to actually move on from that player. So this Tomas Hertl trade does get rid of a massive contract for San Jose, does get them some pretty decent assets back in return, but it does hamper their ability to have not made a trade at this deadline, but also hampering their ability to not make a trade this offseason and going into next year's deadline on top of that. So definitely a trade that kind of handcuffs the San Jose Sharks. But what do they get back? It is a 2025 first-round pick. While the Golden Knights are expected to be very good this season because of their cap circumvention that they're now doing again this season, as it is expected that Mark Stone will be injured for the rest of this season and then miraculously return for Game 1 of the playoffs, which will allow them, going into the playoffs, since there is no salary cap in the postseason, to ice both Tomas Hertl and Noah Hanifin, the two major players that they picked up at this deadline, and end up with like a $110 million team that will likely manage to make some real damage in the playoffs. So their first round pick this season will probably end up being rather late, but perhaps in 2025, if they're forced to play a bit more by the rules, maybe the Golden Knights could end up being slightly worse then, and this could end up being a slightly higher draft pick, who's to say, but maybe not all that much either. And then when it comes to David Edstrom, the actual player acquired by the San Jose Sharks, 2023 first rounder, 32nd overall. Honestly, a pretty good player, is currently playing overseas in the SHL, so the same league that the Sharks have other prospects in, like Philip Bystedt and Matthias Havlid, perhaps why the Sharks are somewhat familiar with him. And he's actually having a decent enough season, not in terms of points, as when you're playing in a man's league as a 19-year-old, it's always going to be very difficult, but technically, he actually has more points this season than Philip Bystedt does have as a 1 year younger player. He was with the Swedish team at the World Juniors as well. Didn't have an outstanding performance, but put up 3 assists as a player underage, so 1 year under the usual, with like I mentioned with Philip Bystedt. So he could be somewhat promising into the future for the San Jose Sharks. Not expected to be like a top 6 player, but perhaps a bottom 6 player who could factor in within the next couple of years. So definitely a completely surprising trade for Tomas Hertl. I would say generally, since the Sharks are not looking to compete over the next 2-3 years, by the time that they were actually going to be good, Tomas Hertl probably would have fallen off more likely than not. And so technically this is a positive trade for San Jose, but definitely much worse than what they could have gotten from 2 years ago. So a bit of a missed opportunity there, but Mike Grier doing the best that he possibly can with the team that he was handed just last season. So definitely got to commend him for that. But that would do it for this trade deadline recap. A pretty crazy day for the San Jose Sharks, as I mentioned. Some questionable trades, others that were obviously huge, and we shall see now how the rest of the season plays out. Obviously, it should be noted that players like Hoffman and Labanc and Barabanov have stuck around and will likely just leave in free agency at the end of the season for free, but that's kind of what happens when your team is one of the worst in the league, and these players like Hoffman, like Labanc, like Barabanov have just put up pitiful seasons. Class dismissed.